Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about the midpoint. The midpoint is a really useful story structure beat to implement into your writing or be familiar with because it can help you avoid a really common problem, which is the mushy middle, the meandering middle, the saggy middle. It has a lot of names, but you've probably all seen it in books that you've read where the beginning is really exciting and then the story really loses momentum in the second act. It starts to feel meandering and like there's not really much point or direction to it. The story's just not that exciting. The midpoint can really help you avoid that by functioning as like a central support beam in the very middle of the story. So to understand the role of the midpoint, first we need to talk about the role of the second act as a whole. So the second act is the middle 50% of your book ended by shorter first and third acts. The middle act features rising action and further complication of the conflict, escalation in the stakes and the tension, and a continual sense of forward motion. It's really important that there's continually new information introduced throughout the second act, so it doesn't feel like the story is continually circling the same information over and over. Act 2 is also where we see relationship development of the core relationships in the story, as well as the character's growth. There's going to be a pretty stark difference between the character at the end of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 3, because they've undergone so much throughout the middle of the book. There's that old saying, in Act 1 you chase your character up a tree, in Act 2 you throw rocks at them, and in Act 3 you let them come back down. Having been up in the tree and having all those rocks thrown at them is going to change them as a person. The middle act is long, and for many writers it's the most problematic to write. I don't know why there's this misconception that the beginning or the ending is the hardest to write, and that may be true for some writers, but I think for the majority of writers, the middle is going to be the hardest to write. In the beginning, you have a bunch of new information to introduce, so it's pretty easy to build momentum, and in the third act, you're closing off everything you've written up until that point, so there's also a lot of inherent momentum. In the middle, things just need to happen, and it's like a huge expansive plot. This can lead to middle acts that drag, that are boring, that lose tension. I mean, how often have you heard it said or said yourself that a book dragged in the middle? It's a very common problem, and one way to help avoid that is by adding a midpoint. The midpoint essentially splits the middle act into two smaller parts, which are a lot easier to manage. The midpoint typically functions as a turning beat, and there are often two different types of midpoints, a false hope midpoint or a false defeat midpoint. So in a false hope midpoint, the character basically thinks the day is won. They think they've succeeded. And then they find out that nope, they have not succeeded, the problem has not been solved, and maybe everything is even worse than they initially thought. In a false defeat midpoint, they think that everything is lost. They think there's no way forward, they think they've lost hope, and then they learn something new that makes them realize, wait, there is still hope. They kind of gotta pick themselves up and forge a new path forward. Either way, this typically causes the character to dramatically reframe their perspective. Maybe their motives shift, maybe they leave with a new fight in them or a new revelation about themselves. So for example, in The Hunger Games, Katniss is in a really bad situation and she takes violent action to get out of it. This really changes her perspective on the games. She realizes that she has to fight to win, she can't just keep running and hiding. This is an example of a false defeat midpoint, because it seems like Katniss has lost, it seems like she has no way out of this situation, and then she finds a new way out of the situation, but through doing that, she has to completely change her perspective. Let's also look at a false hope midpoint. A great example is The Wizard of Oz. Throughout the first half of the book, Dorothy's goal is to get to the Emerald City so that the Wizard of Oz can send her back home to Kansas. And at the midpoint, she arrives at the Emerald City, and so it seems like she's had success, right? And the Wizard of Oz does not help her, and this gives her an entirely new goal, a new set of obstacles she needs to face, and functions as a really dramatic turning point in the story. It's false hope because we think she's succeeded, and then we learn new information that makes us realize that actually, no, she hasn't succeeded. So how do you write an effective midpoint? Here are a few tips. First of all is to change the trajectory of the story. Even if the character's goal is the same from here on out, like in The Hunger Games, Katniss's goal beforehand was to survive and win the games, and after the midpoint it's still to survive and win the games. But she's had a change in perspective that's going to change the trajectory of the story. Maybe the character needs to make a new plan, maybe they have an important revelation, maybe there's a completely new obstacle introduced. This will break up your second act, so it's not just a straight linear path throughout the middle 50% of the book, which is a pretty long time to just be kind of progressing linearly. The next thing to keep in mind is to present new information. The middle of a book will become repetitive and feel kind of pointless if we're just circling the same information over and over. we need to be continually progressed to new information. What can your character learn at the midpoint that changes everything? This is a really great place for a reveal or a plot twist that completely changes and raises the stakes. Next up is to keep in mind your character's growth. The midpoint is a really great place for them to undergo growth or realize that maybe they haven't done as much growth that they thought. A lot of the time, the character will fail at the midpoint when they could have succeeded because they haven't undergone enough character growth yet. So we're able to see that discrepancy between who the character is now and who they need to become in order to succeed eventually. Of course, this is speaking from the perspective of a positive character arc. You could totally have a negative character arc too. I love negative character arcs. In a negative character arc, the difference is that when we're highlighting their flaws, that's the flaw that's going to then kind of consume them and take over. Whereas in a positive character arc, when we're highlighting their flaws, that's the thing they inevitably have to overcome. At the midpoint for a negative character arc, you might get a hint of the character's kind of inner turmoil and darkness that they're going to, from this point onwards, descend further into. Either way, the midpoint is a great catalyst for growth, good or bad. It's going to make them realize how much they need to change in order to get what they want, whether that change is good or bad. Along with character growth, you also want to think about your character's flaws because these things go hand in hand. The midpoint is a great place to showcase your character's flaws because we can see their flaws getting in the way of what could have been a success. Oftentimes, the midpoint maybe could have been the end of the book, but they fail, and they fail because of their flaws. And so the midpoint is a great way to force them to have a change in worldview. Oftentimes, before the midpoint, the character is in a reactionary state, and they realize after the midpoint that they have to be more active from here on out and take matters into their own hands. If the inciting incident is the catalyst for the plot, oftentimes the midpoint is the catalyst for the character's change. It's where they realize that they can't succeed, they can't get what they want as the person they were at the beginning of the book. And finally, make sure it's not just another bump in the road. The midpoint isn't just another obstacle, it's something that actually changes the course of the story. So make sure that it actually has a dramatic and lasting effect on the plot line, or else it's not really a midpoint. It's just an obstacle that you're giving more importance than the other obstacles. If the plot continues along basically the same trajectory before and after the midpoint, it's not really a midpoint. The midpoint is a turning point, which means the plot should turn. It shouldn't just kind of swivel around and come back to where it was going. So that is how to write the midpoint. It is a super useful story beat. I'm not the kind of person who structures my work in like a very structured way. Like I don't follow Save the Cat or the hero's journey, but I do like to be mindful of my midpoint because I find it really helps. This way, when I'm writing the first half of the book, I can write towards the midpoint because I don't outline, and it just gives me some direction. Whereas trying to write towards the end, like that's so far away that it's so difficult. Even if you're a discovery writer, implementing a midpoint can be super, super helpful. I'll leave some other resources and videos on story structure below, since of course the midpoint is part of a grander sense of story structure that you can learn about. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye.